Bumpy Johnson's betrayer thought he escaped for 11 years. Then the razor came out at table 7. The diner was quiet, too quiet. 11 years of running had made him bold. Bumpy Johnson slid into table 7, eyes steady, and the air thickened, threat, reckoning, and the promise of a debt unpaid. The city hummed with its usual night rhythm, tires on wet asphalt, distant laughter, the occasional shout. But Bumpy Johnson heard a different song. He moved through Harlem like a tide that didn't need to announce itself. 11 years. That was how long the man had hidden. Thinking time could erase debts, thinking streets forgot. But the city never forgets. Shadows stretched under the flickering lamplight as he walked past closed storefronts. Shopkeepers paused mid-sweep, heads tilting slightly, recognition in their eyes that didn't require words. Even the stray cats scattered, sensing authority carried quietly, like a scent that lingers after a storm. Bumpy didn't rush. His coat brushed lightly against his legs, shoes tapping a deliberate rhythm on the asphalt. Every step measured, every corner scanned. Whispers followed him, low, subtle, never meant for ears outside the streets, but Bumpy caught them anyway. Names, stories, small tales of who had survived, who had run, who had believed themselves untouchable. The betrayer thought himself clever, untethered, unseen. Yet the city already leaned toward Bumpy, bending time and attention to the inevitability of his arrival. He paused at a corner, not to check the street, but to allow it to check him. A nod passed between two older men leaning on a stoop, silent acknowledgement of what the night would deliver. No one spoke. None had to. The message carried itself. Bumpy didn't need a gun. He didn't need a crowd. Authority had weight, and it moved with him, quiet and undeniable. The man who had run for over a decade was not yet aware that shadows could follow, that silence could press heavier than any threat. And tonight, at table 7, the city itself would speak. The restaurant smelled of old wood and strong coffee, mingling with the faint tang of smoke that never fully left the corners. Table 7 sat at the far end, tucked into a dim alcove where light hesitated to reach. The man had chosen it carefully, thinking concealment would keep him safe. 11 years of shadows and whispers, and yet here he was, counting on distance and familiarity to protect him. Bumpy stepped in without a glance at the waiters, who straightened immediately, hands hovering over trays. The patrons nearest the door paused mid-bite, forks suspended, eyes darting. He walked slowly, deliberately, coat falling straight, fedora tilted just enough to shield his expression. Every step made the floorboards hum with intent. Nothing shouted. Everything spoke. He reached table 7 and stopped, a careful pace that allowed the betrayer's presence to register without warning. The man didn't move. He recognized the calm in the room before he recognized Bumpy himself. 11 years of imagined freedom shattered in an instant. Not by raised voices, not by threats, but by a single pair of dark, unblinking eyes. Other diners sensed it too. Conversation tapered off. Cigarettes burned lower. Even the kitchen felt quieter, as if the walls themselves understood that power had arrived and demanded silence. The betrayer shifted in his chair, small movements betraying nerves he had hidden for over a decade. His hand hovered near a coat pocket, uncertain if it would hide the truth or expose it. Bumpy let the moment stretch, letting the weight of presence press against the space like a tide. The world around table 7 contracted. Chairs felt smaller. Plates seemed heavier. The city outside, with its endless noise, no longer mattered. Here, only the measure of authority could decide the shape of what was to come. A subtle nod, a slight adjustment of the coat. Bumpy didn't rush, and yet the inevitability of consequence was absolute. 11 years were nothing against the measured patience of a man who understood streets, loyalty, and the quiet arithmetic of respect. The betrayer knew now that the past had never forgotten him. That reckoning had been waiting, still as the smoke curling from the last of the candles on the table. The air at table 7 had thickened, and it wasn't from the smoke or the simmering coffee. Bumpy Johnson didn't move closer. He didn't need to. Authority radiated from him like heat from a forge. The betrayer could feel it, a weight pressing against his chest, counting down the seconds of a reckoning he had spent 11 years thinking he had outrun. Around them, the restaurant carried on. Forks clinked, chairs scraped, but every sound felt muted, like the world itself had lowered its volume to respect what was happening. Patrons turned discreetly, sensing tension without understanding it, yet understanding enough. Children clutched hands. Waiters paused mid-step. The betrayer's eyes flicked, darting toward them, but there was no comfort to be found in their confusion. This was between him and Bumpy Johnson, and no one else mattered. Bumpy's gaze swept the man slowly, deliberately. Every line of his coat, every slight tilt of his hat, carried a language older than words. There was no anger in the eyes, no rage. Only assessment, only calculation, only the quiet measure of who deserved respect, who had violated trust, and who would leave table 7 carrying the weight of lesson. The betrayer's hands twitched, brushing the edge of his cup, unsure if the movement would appear casual or desperate. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing emerged. He understood instinctively that speech could make the punishment worse. Silence here was not mercy. It was a gauge. One wrong breath, one slip of composure, and the quiet judgment would tilt. Bumpy leaned just slightly, a movement almost imperceptible, but enough to remind the man that he had been seen in every form of hiding, every shade of fear, every imagined escape. 11 years had tried to build walls, and Bumpy walked past them like a ghost, measured, patient, inevitable. The room contracted further. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed hesitant. Smoke from the betrayer's cigarette rose in a straight line, untouched by wind or chance. Every detail was recorded, every twitch noted. Power didn't need a gun here. Presence had its own blade. And in that blade, the betrayer saw what he had never seen in himself. The truth of debts unpaid, the quiet authority that had followed him longer than he thought possible. Bumpy's lips barely moved, but the words felt present anyway. A warning? Perhaps. A statement? Definitely. Every man in that room understood that table 7 would remember this night. The past had returned, and it carried the weight of inevitability. The betrayal hadn't stayed hidden behind the walls of whispered meetings and secret letters. It had seeped into Harlem like smoke from a fire left untended. The city knew, in the small gestures and half-spoken words, that something long buried had resurfaced. And now, at table 7, Bumpy Johnson intended that everyone see it, not in shouts, not in fists, but in the weight of presence. The room itself seemed to respond to him. Chairs aligned subconsciously, cups paused mid-air, and conversations faltered, threads of chatter dying before they could complete. People didn't need to ask what had happened. The eyes alone, steady, controlled, unyielding, spoke volumes. Everyone knew who sat across from the betrayer, and everyone knew what silence meant when wielded by a man like Bumpy. The betrayer fidgeted, the smooth facade he had worn for 11 years cracking in the smallest of ways. A twitch at the jaw, a finger brushing the table, a subtle tightening of the shoulders. 11 years of imagined safety, each day building a story that he was untouchable, had ended in a glance, a tilt of Bumpy's head, a presence so certain it made air itself feel heavy. Bumpy didn't rush. He never did. Timing was a weapon he carried like a blade hidden in a sleeve. The city outside might have been restless, full of gossip and speculation, but inside this small, dimly lit restaurant, he dictated the rhythm. Every sip of coffee, every turn of a chair, every glance at a waitress crossing the room was accounted for. Nothing escaped him. Nothing escaped the story he was writing now, line by line, movement by movement. The betrayer's pride faltered further when he realized that others in the restaurant weren't just observers. They were participants. Their hushed breaths, their hesitant movements, their quiet acknowledgement of Bumpy's authority extended the punishment beyond mere observation. Respect, violated years ago, was being corrected in full view. Community, silently, was weighing in, No one applauded. No one intervened. The lesson was being administered with restraint, and that made it sharper. Bumpy's gaze lingered, precise and deliberate, marking the betrayer's every flicker of fear, every hesitation. The man's mouth opened once, as if to speak, then closed. He knew there was nothing to say that could alter the balance. The crowd, even in its quiet, reinforced the inevitability. Loyalty to Bumpy Johnson wasn't just personal. It was woven into the streets, into the corners, into the very heartbeat of Harlem. Time stretched. The air pressed closer, thick with history, with power, with moral principle. The betrayer could feel every one of his escapes, every lie, every betrayal, compressed into the space between two steady, unflinching eyes. The lesson wasn't in punishment alone. It was in making him understand that respect, once lost, could only be regained on Bumpy's terms. And Bumpy would decide if, when, and how that happened. No one left table 7 without absorbing the weight of what had occurred. Quiet authority had spoken louder than years of fear. Harlem had watched. The streets would talk. And the betrayer had finally learned that time didn't erase debts. It only postponed their reckoning. The air in the restaurant was almost sacred now, thick with smoke and tension, as if every particle waited for the moment to be claimed. Bumpy Johnson sat, calm, coat draped like armor over broad shoulders, eyes steady and unblinking. Across from him, the betrayer shifted, uneasy, aware that 11 years of imagined immunity had collapsed in a heartbeat. No words were exchanged. There was no need. The story had been told in the lean tilt of Bumpy's head, in the slow, deliberate placement of his hands on the table, in the quiet calculation of every glance. The betrayer's fingers drummed lightly, betraying the dance of panic restrained by years of habit. Yet Bumpy's presence made even habit feel fragile, as if it could crumble under the sheer gravity of attention. The razor appeared almost as an afterthought, though everyone saw it. Smooth, sharp, the glint of steel caught a sliver of tungsten light and held it, suspended like a promise. Bumpy didn't brandish it, didn't threaten with noise or flourish. He simply allowed it to exist, a tool of authority resting against inevitability. It was understood. A life could end here, but only under his measure, only in silence and precision. Other diners froze in place, their plates forgotten, coffee cooling. Harlem had taught them to read power when it didn't announce itself with gunfire or shouting. Every eye in the room tracked the subtle movements. The slight lean forward of Bumpy, the betrayer's swallow, the faint tremor in a hand. The community was watching, silently reinforcing the lesson. Betrayal could be traced, and loyalty, once broken, could never escape reckoning. Bumpy's gaze locked onto the betrayer's. The razor stayed in his palm, quiet, contained. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. The power was in the waiting, in letting fear recognize itself before action. A single breath, measured and deliberate, carried the weight of judgment, of history, of principle. 11 years of lies and escapes had led to this precise instant of reckoning. Then, in a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for adjusting a napkin, the razor's edge pressed lightly, just enough to make the betrayer's breath hitch. No blood spilled. No screams eruptive. Respect had been restored, authority reaffirmed, and a life remembered to the full measure of its debt. The moment ended. Silence remained. Harlem exhaled with the city's invisible witness, understanding that justice could exist without chaos, that power lived in restraint, and that some lessons were taught only at table 7. The restaurant emptied slowly, each patron carrying a fragment of what had happened at table 7. Plates clinked against counters, chairs scraped the floor, but no one spoke of the razor, the tension, or the breath that had hung frozen in the room. Bumpy Johnson remained seated for a moment longer, coat still draped, eyes scanning the space like a silent ledger being closed. Outside, Harlem was already shifting, absorbing the story in whispers and sidelong glances. Shopkeepers straightened as if the weight of unseen eyes passed down their aisles. Children paused mid-step on stoops, feeling the gravity of streets that had learned a new rhythm of respect and restraint. The city did not shout. It simply bent slightly, acknowledging that authority had walked through its veins and left the pulse change forever. The betrayer walked away, shoulders tight, aware that no one needed to follow him. The memory alone was sufficient, an invisible mark that would last a lifetime. 11 years of perceived freedom had vanished not with fire, not with noise, but with a glance, a presence, and a razor held as an emblem of inevitability. Every step he took reminded him that loyalty was measured, not assumed, and that community watched even when it appeared silent. Bumpy finally rose, the movement deliberate, controlled, like a man closing a chapter in a ledger that the world would read in time. The coat shifted over broad shoulders. The quiet authority of years of survival radiated from him, unspoken but unmistakable. The lesson was not in vengeance, but in the preservation of principle, in the understanding that power could exist without chaos, and that respect was earned and recorded in the memory of witnesses, not in headlines. As Bumpy Johnson disappeared into the night, Harlem exhaled, not in relief but in acknowledgement. Streets, stoops, and shop windows carried the echo of restraint, a quiet imprint that would outlast any argument, any plan, any fleeting defiance. Power had walked through the city that night, and its legacy was as enduring as the rhythm of the streets themselves, a reminder that some men are remembered not for what they take, but for how they command what must remain.